Kia ora, ngā mihi nui, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Welcome to you all to this kind of opening session. As Susan said, I'm going to paint a slightly bigger picture around some of these things, but I just wanted to say fantastic presentation. Thank you, Joanne. Great work from Hagar. And there are some wonderful organisations here, so I hope all of you who are visiting get a chance to go and talk to people, hear the stories, look at what you can do in the areas represented here in the marketplace and beyond. What I'm also going to do is point out, Joanne talked about kind of three ways we can make change. You know, we can kind of act as a ethical consumer. We get involved ourselves. You know, we can pay more for things that we should pay more for, and so on. There's another way that we can act, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that, which is the way we use our money. But first, let me kind of introduce myself with an alternative kaupapa. It kind of started, you know, I'm from New Zealand and from Tamaki Makaurau, a very, very proud Jaffa, but part of this journey started in Rio de Janeiro in 1992 with something called the Earth Summit. And I was working at WWF at the time, and I was on the British government delegation. But that was the time, that was the biggest ever conference, world conference that had been held. And it was all about this issue of sustainable development. And it was around this kind of concept that we could bring these, particularly kind of Western concern for environmentalism, together with the legitimate aspirations of people in developing countries to get out of poverty and have a right to development. We could bring these two things together in a concept called sustainable development. And at its time, it was really important and significant. And there was a deal on the table at the Earth Summit that if it had been taken by governments, could have actually transformed our world over the intervening 25 years. And that path was not taken, and primarily because politicians lacked vision and didn't step up to the challenge. Sort of from that, I kind of went and lived in the UK for a while. It's a guy called Sir Jonathan Porritt, who I worked with a lot around that time. We did campaigning around sweatshops and anti-slavery and fair trade and GMOs and a whole lot of other stuff, and set up things like a scheme called the Ethical Trading Initiative, worked on fair trade, and then came back to New Zealand. In the top right-hand corner, I was CEO of Oxfam for 10.5 years in New Zealand, and really kind of focused our work on the Pacific, and particularly the poorer parts of the Pacific. And you know, often our images of the Pacific are formed by places we go to on holiday, and we don't sometimes see the reality of lives for people in the Pacific, and particularly in poorer parts of Melanesia, where kids do not get a chance to go to school, they don't get adequate health care. There is a poverty of opportunity that is as deep as poverty anywhere in the world, and it's on our doorstep. If we're not going to do anything about it, then who will? So this is kind of a plea for us to recognise our particular responsibilities towards our Pacific neighbours. I then did some work in setting up a sustainability program at the University of Auckland Business School, and got an award for work on sustainability from the Sustainable Business Network. All the time I was doing some campaigning. This is a photo. I don't know if you can see it properly, but it's from the campaign around the launch of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, the TPPA, a couple of years ago. And that's Queen Street, and it's full of people. And I don't know if you can see the scale of this, but you know, people have done some counts on the number of people on that demonstration. We had over 35,000 people, and I was coordinator of the campaign at that time, working with Jane Kelsey and others, and we had a majority of the New Zealand public who said, don't sign this thing. And that was a touchstone. I'm still working on those trade issues. It's really an important way that we can take action to change the rules on global trade in order to make sure that corporations behave well in the international system. And it harks back to some of the things that the True Cost video was showing, that Joanne showed, that actually we need to change the fundamentals of the way the system works. Then I got called into Parliament as a Green Party MP, a list MP. I went into Parliament when a Green MP stepped down, left Parliament, Kevin Haigh. So I had a little less than a year in Parliament before the last election. I didn't get in, as some of you remember. The Green Party vote kind of went down quite precipitously. And I am now, have since then been setting up a new venture called Mindful Money. And I'll talk more about that later on in the presentation. But just to say, I mean, the thread that is through a lot of this is how we can make change. And, you know, we can make change through campaigning and lobbying governments. We can make change through work of NGOs and working on the ground and you know, the great work that Oxfam does, Hager does, you know, many organisations do. We can make change through educating the next generation. We can make change through Parliament and through politics. But I think the one that we often forget is that money makes the world go round. So I'll come back to that theme. So let's start off with climate change. You know, we all find climate change pretty scary. It's for good reasons, but we also ought to remind ourselves that climate change isn't the only problem. And you know, we are in an era where we are living beyond our planetary boundaries. And climate change is one manifestation of that. But it's not the only manifestation. And sometimes I think, you know, we absolutely need to take the strategic challenge of climate change very, very seriously, and it's very, very urgent and getting more urgent by the day. But also, let's not lose sight of all of the other boundaries that we are breaching in our planetary system. And you'll see in here that there are a number of those, the phosphorus and nitrogen cycles being two of them. Coupled with that, we're also breaching human boundaries. This parking meter earns more in an hour than 70% of the world's population does in a day. You know, there's some mismatch in values in our world. These are slightly old figures, but you know, we have almost 1 billion people who live in poverty. So what can we do? This is a lovely chart from somebody called Kate Rayworth. If you haven't read about donut economics, it's a really powerful book, a powerful way to reconceptualize the way we think about economics. And what she says, yes, we need to take care of our planetary boundaries, but we also need to take care of human needs. And she's kind of put these two together in a diagrammatic way, which I think is really helpful. And it's called the donut. And the donut is the safe and just space for humanity. And it's saying that, yes, we need to make sure that we take action on climate change. But whatever we do, we need to also recognize that there are people in our world who need to have the same rights that we take for granted. The human rights that we all enjoy ourselves, the right to shelter, the right to food, the right to safety. You know, these are human rights in the same way that we normally define civil and political rights. Climate change is one of those breaches of human rights that is taking place in countries like Kiribati at the moment. And the thing that's often driven me about climate change, since starting work on it in the early 1990s, is that it is a fundamental injustice. The people who are suffering most from climate change did the least to cause the problem. And you can take that at a country level by saying it's the developing countries who are bearing the brunt, but you can also take it down to an individual and community level and say it's actually the poorer and vulnerable communities who are suffering, whereas the kind of rich people get to maybe they have to let go of their batch on the beach after a while, but ultimately they're going to be fine. But the people who don't have the choices are the ones who suffer. And that's an issue that we have to keep in mind as another rationale for us to act urgently on climate change. And in New Zealand, we're just not doing enough. There's two things wrong with this photo. One is that's not where methane comes from. And secondly, this is about trading emissions, which has been proven to do very little about stopping climate change. We need to get serious about addressing climate change in this country. There's a big debate with the farming community around, will methane and agricultural emissions be included? Hello? We haven't got time not to say, oh, I'm sorry, half of our emissions are beyond the bounds of emissions reductions. Actually, we're at a stage where we have to take urgent action, and somehow that message isn't getting through. So, for all of you who are active on climate change issues, this is actually a really good time to take action, because the government hasn't finally nailed its climate change legislation. All kind of power to James Shaw as Minister for Climate Change, but the government needs to hear from us to say that we want them to go further and faster on climate change. Because ultimately, the things that we're going to do to address climate change are good for us, They're going to create a better society. We're going to have better energy systems. We're going to be able to sustain our native forests and hopefully grow our native forests significantly. We're going to have sustainability, green jobs, livable cities, etc. These are things that we all treasure, and so we need to make some of these changes, whether or not we have climate change. But there's another issue, and the other issue is this issue of money. And I'm overly fond of this cartoon because it kind of says a lot, So if you can't read it, yes, the planet got destroyed, but for a beautiful moment in time, we created a lot of value for shareholders. And that's the way we've been running the economy. And so much of the economic activity and what corporations do is not just driven by their customers, not just driven by people inside the company. It's driven by the people who own the capital. And there was kind of a lovely saying that happened in an OECD workshop that really stuck with me. It was after a company had been really buffeted by campaigners targeting them for in fact, it was one of the campaigns that I was involved in. And the company had come under a lot of pressure from the public around what they were doing. And he said, "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but institutional investors can fire me." And it was this thing about, actually, companies respond to pressure from the people that own them and ultimately that can fire them. And unless we get that pressure going, then actually all of our consumer campaigns and our ethical trade and our ethical sourcing and everything ain't going to change the kind of the core of the big end of town in terms of the companies. And so if we want to change the system, we've also got to change the money that sits in behind the system. And, as campaigners, sometimes we don't like money. You know, kind of it's we haven't necessarily got most of it in the world. You know, most of it is sitting in tax havens somewhere in Cayman Islands, or but you know, we need to tackle the issue of money in order to be able to change the system. We need to change that logic, and that, I think, is one of our big challenges ahead of us collectively. We did a survey last year with Colmar Brunton, and the survey asked people, what don't you want in your KiwiSaver or your investment fund? And people said, we don't want companies that make profits out of animal cruelty. We don't want companies that make profits out of human rights abuses or labour rights abuses or tobacco, gambling, palm oil, military weapons, personal firearms, fossil fuels, junk foods, pornography, etc. And these numbers are big. You know, this is you know, in some cases over 90% of people saying, I don't want my KiwiSaver invested in these companies. So, question for you all, you're smart, articulate kind of active people, who knows what's in your KiwiSaver account? Or, sorry, first, who's got a KiwiSaver account? Okay, represented the population, most people. Out of you, who knows what's in your KiwiSaver account in terms of companies that might be doing these things? A couple of you. And the reality is that less than 1% of KiwiSaver accounts exclude issues like gambling and pornography. And only 2% of KiwiSaver accounts exclude fossil fuels. So there are, the vast majority of you will be having KiwiSaver accounts that include these kind of issues. Companies that make profits out of these kinds of issues are the companies that your KiwiSaver invests in. And I think that's fundamentally wrong. You know, we ought to be able to choose where our money goes. You know, it's like, it's an empowerment thing. You know, that if we don't know where our money goes, and we can't choose where our money goes, then actually we're perpetrating the stuff in the system that we don't like. You know? And ideally what we'd love our money to be spent on is things that do good in society. But the first step is to do no harm. And that's the step we've got to take. And in a way, that's why I set up this new organisation called Mindful Money, to help people along this path of saying, okay, let's do no harm, let's do better, let's do good with our money. And so this is kind of what we're doing. Oh, this is dreadfully complicated. But actually, the one thing about this is you start over here. These are all kind of traditional investments that your money is in fossil fuels and everything else. You can get investments that exclude stuff, you know, that screens out the things that you don't like, screens out the unacceptable investments like tobacco, human rights, and fossil fuels. And then you've got the thing called, in the jargon, ESG management, environment, social governance management, which actually goes a little bit beyond that and kind of has a wider set of things you can screen out, and it kind of invests in better companies. But still, you know, you're not necessarily going to say that's quite where you want to be. And then you've got the sustainably themed investments, which is kind of interesting because it's about sectors like renewable energy or affordable housing, the kind of things, the sort of things that we want to invest in. And then you've got impact investment, which is investing to create positive impact in society. And then, kind of on the right-hand side, you've got philanthropy. So, or giving money to charity. So as you go along, the amount of money that you earn, people used to say, if you invest ethically, you're going to earn less money. And it's absolutely not true. The research shows, and this is kind of a real change over the last 20 years, the research shows that actually if you invest in ways that are responsible, then you're going to have returns that are at least as high, if not higher, than the traditional investment. If you think about it, it's kind of obvious. You're not investing in the kind of companies that are going to do what Volkswagen does and Johnson & Johnson does and BP does and you know, all of these companies that behave badly ultimately bear the price of their bad behavior. And the better companies tend to be those that really start to act on sustainability. They generate consumer loyalty, consumer awareness, and they do better. So, you know, companies that do better financially. And that should be obvious, but it hasn't been in the world of finance. So increasingly now we've got the research to show that. And so if you see the line that says financial returns, actually in here the returns are high or higher than they are in traditional investment. And you know, it's kind of interesting because it turns the question from why would you invest kind of responsibly and in line with your values? And it changes that question why you do it to why not. You know, there's no financial penalty for doing it. You get to invest in better companies. You feel better about your own investments, the change that you're making in the world, and your returns are high. And as this bottom line shows, you do good as you move along the spectrum. This is the kind of spectrum that we're kind of moving along, that traditional investments are neutral or negative, and then you screen out stuff and that avoids harm, and you introduce some higher standards, so it tilts it towards better standards, and then you get to higher impact and eventually to be able to do impact investing. And so that's what Mindful Money is doing, to try and help people move along the spectrum towards higher impact. And why? You know, because we can help these kind of issues. And the interesting thing is that the Sustainable Development Goals for the first time provides a nice focus for what kind of investments can contribute to impact across the dimensions of positive change in society. And some of the exciting thinking that's happening is some of those impact companies being able to put their to be able to map their impact according to the Sustainable Development Goals. And it's kind of, for example, there's this great British fund called WHEB that invests in kind of four good companies, and they produce an annual report, which isn't about, you know, here's how much money we've made. They talk about that, but they also talk about here's the tons of greenhouse gas emissions that you have avoided. You know, here's the rivers you've cleaned up. Here's the affordable houses that you've helped build. And you know, that's starting to be the kind of fund that we want to invest in. So Mindful Money is also working with the funds, the financial community in New Zealand, to push them in that direction and say, yes, people care about these issues. And our role is to be able to do the awareness raising, the education, and to help people understand their impact so that they can tell you, the fund managers, that we want to move along this spectrum. And in a way, there's a nice parallel with the story of fair trade in New Zealand. This is kind of increase in sales and fair trade. Sorry about the scale, but these are different products. For example, the blue on the bottom is coffee. That was a result of a kind of sustained campaign over a decade. I was at Oxfam, Michaelia and others at Trade Aid were our partners in the campaign. And basically it took fair trade into the mainstream and drove growth in fair trade 45% per annum, which was the fastest in the world. So you know, that's kind of what we can do in New Zealand when people get the message around how important it is to change their behaviour. And that's what we want to do on money. We want to say, okay, let's have people get the message on being able to be responsible with the way they invest their money, and we can have that kind of change happening in society. And ultimately, you know, these fund managers, this financial sector, will react when they understand that people care about the issues and they start acting. And that's what Mindful Money is going to do. So the platform for Mindful Money is due to go out in beta form in a couple of weeks' time. There's a website there you can sign up to if you want to be part of the beta test and get an early look at the kind of things that you can invest in, what's in your KiwiSaver, etc. And I hope, you know, once we launch, hopefully with a bit of media coverage and lots of social media, that you'll be able to change your investment along that pathway towards greater impact. So thank you all very much, and keep up the great work.
Fantastic, truly inspiring. Questions for Barry? You must have questions. Okay, I really am going to throw this. Yes to you.
Oh, good catch.
Awesome, yeah, great, incredible presentation. I've always thought of, I guess, writing to government or doing something in that way, but I've never felt confident to go online and figure out what's the most. I don't just want to send a letter and think it's not actually going to get there and I've spent all this time on it. So how, your experience there or your knowledge being in government, how can we write and who do we write to in the field of, say, I guess ethics and especially climate change as well?
Yeah. So there's a great quote from Noam Chomsky who said, you know, if you do something once, that's great by way of campaigning. If you keep on doing things and if you deepen your involvement and you do more, then actually that changes the world. And it's really true that if you're in politics and you get a sort of click petition where you know somebody's kind of been surfing through petitions, they've kind of gone to the petition, they've clicked the button that says add my name to the petition, you know, you get one of these and maybe it's kind of 5,000 people, gee, that's not many, 50,000 people, oh yeah, a lot of people care about that. But if you get sort of 20 letters in a week where people have bothered to sit down and write you a letter on an issue, particularly if it's not a form letter, it's kind of, oh, actually people do really care about that issue. And it's just kind of saying, and then if you get somebody who fronts up to a meeting or a demonstration, you know, or meets with an MP or raises an issue in a meeting, that really counts. It does. And politicians are, if nothing else, extremely attuned to what people are thinking and doing, even if they pretend not to be. And so it's to say, yes, your voice really counts, and people think of democracy as going along to vote every 3 years. Actually, the hard work in democracy and the really valuable work in democracy is all the things you do between elections in order to shape the thinking of politics and political parties. And so, yeah, that really, it's well worth writing that letter.
Just going back to global goals for sustainable development.
Yeah.
Can you just elaborate a little bit more on how and who had a hand in developing those?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I probably have to step back a decade and a half, in a bit longer. In the year 2000, there was something called the Millennium campaign. It was all about, you know, how we're going to be better in the new millennium, and we're going to address all these issues. And it came up with something called the Millennium Development Goals. And their headline was, we're going to halve poverty by 2015. And there were a whole lot of other goals to it. And basically, the fact that the UN had these goals and they were all adopted by all countries, it was initially quite irrelevant because nothing was done about it. And then civil society organizations, particularly in developing countries, because these goals were aimed at developing countries, civil society started picking up these goals and started saying, you know, it says here that we're going to double the proportion of people who have access to clean water. What are you doing as a government about our access to clean water? You know, our kids are dying from dirty water. And those campaigns started across the Millennium Development Goals. And it turned out that they were immensely powerful in many parts of the developing world. Not quite so much where there were really repressive governments and there was no form of democracy, but a lot in those societies where there was a democratic voice. And so they became really important. Governments didn't do enough. You know, if you look at the data, a lot of the goals were apparently achieved, but that was primarily because China had rapid growth and brought a lot of people out of poverty, and that kind of skewed the results. In the end, sub-Saharan Africa, some countries did well, but most didn't. The Pacific, the poorer Melanesian countries, particularly PNG, missed most of the targets. So let's fast forward to then 2015. There was a process to say, what are we going to do after the Millennium Development Goals, and how can we make this connect with sustainability, with climate change, with issues like that? And there was a very kind of long UN process with lots of consultations around to different organizations and governments and so on that led up to these Sustainable Development Goals. And the SDGs should apply to every country, including New Zealand. So most people in New Zealand haven't heard of the SDGs. There is no campaign to tell people about the SDGs. The government has been, I think, guilty of extreme mismanagement of their responsibilities to tell people about the SDGs and to coordinate what they're actually doing to address these issues in New Zealand, but also to what New Zealand is doing to help other countries address these issues. And so there's kind of various forums. There was a conference held in Victoria University last year on it. There's one coming up this year, which will be at AUT in September on the SDGs and what New Zealand is doing about it. My view is that governments here and abroad won't do anything about it until civil society stands up and says, we want you to do it. Those campaigns are kind of a little bit slow in evolving, you know, it's the kind of thing where I think actually it's a really good opportunity to be able to provide a kind of an influence over government policy. The one other thing is that I mentioned that some companies are starting to do stuff about the SDGs. It potentially is quite significant also in being able to influence companies. To be able to say, what are you doing as a company around addressing these goals? And to force them to get beyond the greenwash, where they kind of paint what they're doing in pretty colours, and say, no, actually, what are you doing to address these goals? And so it has power for use there. But above all, I think we should regard them as a tool that we can use, as well as a kind of an aspiration for better well-being.
Oh, thank you. Hang on.
Good catch.
Brilliant presentation. I'm totally behind you. I've worked for corporates, so and I've come up against it myself. So I'm still learning about United Nations.
Yep.
Yeah. So when they set these goals, what's the expectation of United Nations? What's the expectation of the countries who have been involved in it?
It's interesting. Sorry.
So do they have to report on their progress?
Yes, they do. They do. And New Zealand's reported, and we didn't see it in our newspapers, did we?
No.
It is part of this thing that there has been no concerted effort from the government, and sadly enough, not even this new government on the SDGs. So New Zealand has another report that's due fairly soon. Again, we need to push them on reporting, make sure that the reporting is objective. There's an organisation called HUIE, which is doing some work on what an alternative report might look like, a shadow report to track the government report. And as I said, there's a conference coming up in September. The UN's role is kind of really to act as a point to receive those monitoring reports from countries. And they haven't really got much power or money to do much. Although with the Millennium Development Goals, kind of 2 decades ago, the one thing that the UN did really well is that they did a campaign to publicise the Millennium Development Goals, particularly in developing countries, and that really helped kick them off. They haven't done it in the same way for the Sustainable Development Goals. So, again, we need the kind of public awareness campaigns and the kind of NGOs picking up this issue in order for them to gain traction. So we can't really look to the UN to do this. They're kind of more of a kind of monitoring space. Really, I think, again, it's up to civil society to really push for these. Good throw.
So my question was kind of like, when you're talking about the KiwiSaver thing and like what is our money invested in, I've kind of thought about it in the past. I'm like, how do I find out if my money is going into something? Is there a way to find out what your money is invested in, and is there positive alternative KiwiSavers available to invest your money in that you know of? Or is that what you're trying to find out on the start?
Yeah, so in Mindful Money, where the platform's kind of in the final couple of weeks of design, so it's kind of all over the place, but you'll be able to go on the platform and say, it'll say, what's your KiwiSaver? Do you want to find out what's in your KiwiSaver? So you put in there, I don't know, ASB Growth Fund. And it'll come up and say, well, actually, you've got maybe 5% in fossil fuels, you've got 1% in gambling, you've got some pornography in there, you've got some human rights abuses, etc. And it'll list the companies that are responsible for those percentages on the right-hand side. So you'll be able to look over and say, oh, okay, I've got lots of ExxonMobil in there, I've got some all sorts of companies. And then it'll say, it'll ask you for a little bit of information about kind of what you want to see from an investment. What values do you really care about? Is it environmental issues? Is it climate change? Is it social justice? And what do you really care about? And are you saving for 30 years or are you saving for 5 years? And then it'll say, okay, based on what you've told me, here are a number of funds that meet your criteria. Okay. And so you can, and it'll tell you everything about them, how much, what their return has been in the past, what their policies are, what their fee structure is, etc. And so you'll be able to click. And if you click, then that company pays a little bit of money to us to help run the site. We're a charity, so that's the way the system works.
Thank you.
So hopefully that'll be up and running in beta form in a few weeks, and then in full form in late April or so.
Okay, thank you.